War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 42, The World Reacts to Yom Kippur. In 1967, the secret to warfare was revealed to the Western world. Well-led tank formations guarded overhead by well-trained jet pilots above. The qualitative advantage of the West more than enough to counter the quantitative advantages of the Soviet bloc. Even the subpar French-made AMX tanks were more than enough to defeat, again, the T-55s of the Soviet Union. The T-62 and T-64 couldn't be that much better. And what a difference a scant 6 years made. 1967 was also before Tet. In 1967, the U.S. was winning in Vietnam, much as it always won every war. Again, the helicopter-borne superior light infantry was countering the poorly armed, trained, and equipped guerrilla forces. But by October 1973, the U.S. had left Vietnam on terms, while not quite a surrender, certainly not showing victory. And then the phantoms fell from the sky. Not just from the long-range SA-2s, but the new SA-6s, the ZSU-23-4s, and handheld Strelas. The top jet in the American arsenal, no match for the latest Soviet technology. Likewise, the vaunted, seemingly invincible Israeli tank corps losing brigades worth of tanks, apparently from the new wire-guided missiles and the T-62's 115mm gun, outsizing, by numbers at least, the 105mm main gun standard on all Western tanks at the time. And, even worse, the T-64 had come out with an even larger 125mm gun. So advanced was the T-64 that the Soviets wouldn't share it with any ally except East Germany. NATO-esque equipment and doctrine couldn't defeat the Egyptians and Syrians. What chance did it stand against the Warsaw Pact? Never mind the ignoble defeat in the jungles of Vietnam. And now, the unlimited pool of American men was gone. The draft army of pre-World War II had been replaced with the all-volunteer force. No longer a cross-section of America. The AVF was what was left after college and good jobs were excluded. The future was uncertain. In anticipation of this uncertain future of warfare, the U.S. Army stood up Training and Doctrine Command only months before the war, known as TRADOC. Dozens of civilian and military analysts went to Israel to learn what lessons they could. The first and most important lesson was that combined arms was still key to maneuver warfare. Based upon the victory in 1967, Israel dispensed with updating its mechanized infantry and artillery corps. Infantry in the back of armored personnel carriers couldn't fight, and who needs artillery when you have responsive air support? Well, that works well when you don't have an enemy who can counter your armor and aircraft with missiles, many of which are manned by infantry. You need indirect fire to prep your advance, lay smoke, and suppress your enemy. And your first attack may not be successful. You have to be able to integrate follow-on forces to seamlessly continue the fight as your first echelon forces culminate. The U.S. Army also determined that the primary reason the Israelis held in the Golan Heights against seemingly overwhelming forces was the superior training of their tank crews and small unit leaders. This culminated in the major output of the nascent TRADOC and Field Manual 100-5 Air-Land Battle. The overriding principle of the new doctrine was, quote, "The U.S. Army must, above all else, prepare to win the first battle of the next war." For years, the U.S. Army had relied on the superior might of American manufacturing to carry the day, from Task Force Smith in Korea or the Kasserine Pass in World War II. When wars are measured in years, you can learn your lessons on the fly and adapt. But now, wars are measured in days, if not hours. Losing the first battle is no longer a luxury American soldiers could afford. Since the Iron Curtain was drawn across Central Europe, separating NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the defining doctrine was an active defense in depth, attriting the communist forces as they drove through Germany, and withdrawing in a detailed and highly planned manner, causing them to culminate before the key ports in Belgium and the Netherlands were lost. Massive reinforcements from the United States regularly rehearsed in what were known as the redeployment of forces to Germany, or Reforger. But with the distances armored forces could move, Reforger could not respond to the surprise attack like the Israelis used in 1967 and the Egyptians and Syrians used in 1973. Another factor is that almost 20 years since World War II had ended, the Germans didn't particularly like their country being used as a large-scale battlefield to save France and the Low Countries. France, for its part, having withdrawn from NATO, was willing to fight the Soviets to the last German. Combined with the lessons from the Arab-Israeli conflicts, John Boyd's patterns of conflicts saw that defeating the modern mechanized force required not so much the destruction of the lead element as the logistics chain supporting them. A series of flanking counterattacks going after the fuel and munitions and follow-on forces would be just as effective as destroying the lead elements. You remember that in 1956, it took the Israelis days to maneuver to Sharm el-Sheikh, mostly due to their maintenance and supply, and not so much Arab resistance. Where these counterattacks would start from and where they would attack would depend upon conditions on the ground. They couldn't be pre-planned as the active defenses of the German Defense Plan, or GDP, had been built around. They required highly trained field-grade officers, making the call on what intelligence they could gather. The size of the battlefield for each echelon was massively increased. Under the GDP, a brigade commander might consider a battlefield only a few miles in depth. Now it was more than 10, the division commander thinking 50 miles out. Rather than years of planning with well-rehearsed routes, battalion commanders had 8 hours to develop his plans and execute. Highly dependent on this concept was an integrated air arm, which the Air Force was unwilling to provide. Air-land battle, despite its name, was rejected as doctrine by the Air Force, whose own planning cycles were too rigid to adapt to the high tempo. As such, the U.S. reinvigorated a high-tech replacement for the armed helicopters of Vietnam. Originally, the U.S. Army wanted the AH-56 Cheyenne, a very fast replacement for the Cobra, utilizing a pusher propeller in addition to the main rotor. The U.S. Air Forces were able to kill this program by procuring the A-10, promising to provide any support to ground forces the U.S. Army required. However, it was clear by the late 1970s this was not going to happen, so the AH-64 Apache was approved for procurement. Likewise, the Bradley fighting vehicle was identified to replace the M113 armored personnel carrier, and the M1 Abrams tank to replace the aging M60 Patton, itself merely an upgrade from the 40s era M48. These vehicles were based on speed. The Bradley was a response to the BMP, which also had a cannon and mounted a Sagar missile. Instead of the 50 caliber heavy machine gun 113, the infantry carrier would be a tank killer with tow missiles and a highly upgraded 25mm cannon. In addition, the Israelis learned that no matter how good your own air force, you have to be prepared to counter enemy air from the ground. The U.S. Army started procurement on the Patriot missile system accordingly. Ultimately, awaiting the enemy's first strike was a luxury no one could afford. The Israelis were forced by their reliance on American support to take the first blow. It cost them almost 10,000 casualties, and nearly cost them the Galilee. For Israel's part, they embarked on developing indigenous mainline fighting equipment. Most famous is their Merkava, meaning chariot tank. This tank, now on its 5th iteration, had numerous innovations. Its engine was in the front. While this is claimed to add survivability, more importantly, it allowed for an empty rear compartment. This compartment is often claimed to provide a troop-carrying capability, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it certainly isn't the primary purpose. It allows troops to load ammunition without going through the top turret. As they learned holding off the Syrians, you may have to resupply under fire, something impossible with most tanks. In addition, troops could enter and exit from the back, and guarded from the enemy to their front. The compartment could hold additional ammunition or be used to evacuate casualties. The tank had a very maneuverable suspension which sacrificed speed for cross-country mobility in rocky terrain, a unique Israeli demand. Additionally, the front barrel could depress farther than most tanks, allowing them to fight behind hills that other Western tanks could not. While the first Merkava didn't include it, future models had an integrated 60mm mortar, allowing each tank to use indirect fire. The experiences of the 73 war and the Sagar-equipped infantry had the Israelis focused on how to suppress and engage infantry hidden behind rocks and dunes. After the French abandoned support for the Israelis, they were stuck for aircraft, having relied almost exclusively on French-model aircraft. Not willing to be without jet aircraft, they started production of the Nesher, a copy of the French Mirage 5, from plans stolen with assistance from the Swiss. The Nesher performed well in the air-to-air role in 1973 and was upgraded into the Kippur. Neshers were sold to the Argentinians who used them in 1982 under the name Daggers. The upgraded Kippur used the same J-79 engine as the Phantoms and was designed as an air-to-air fighter. In 1976, U.S. support to Israel increased and promised F-15s were seen as superior, so the Kippur's combat life in Israel was short-lived. It remained in service in Sri Lanka, Colombia, and as U.S. Navy aggressor aircraft. All of this was not cheap. While the U.S. complains of NATO's current failure to spend 2% of GDP on defense, in 1975, Israel spent 30% of its GDP on its defense. Egypt, while not winning the war, and in the opinion of Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev actually losing badly, had regained control of the Suez. The surrounding of the Egyptian Third Army and the IDF having significant forces on the west side of the Suez was largely hidden from the Egyptian population and the Arab world writ large. Sadat was able to use this great victory, at least in the public's eyes, as a means to make peace acceptable to Egypt's population. He incessantly talked of the brave men of Ramadan and the great victory of the Egyptian army liberating the Sinai. This talking point became so pervasive that a designed suburb of Cairo is named the 10th of Ramadan City, after the starting point of the war. There is an additional suburb named the 6th of October City near Giza. Sadat used his status and self-proclaimed victory to negotiate very positive terms during the negotiations in Sweden in what would be known as the Camp David Accords. Both Israel and Egypt would be given billions of dollars in annual U.S. military aid. Egypt would regain full control of the Suez, itself worth nearly $10 billion a year, and the return of 100% of the Sinai. Israel offered, and Egypt refused, the Gaza Strip. All Israeli settlements in the Sinai would be torn down and the Jews expelled. Finally, instead of UN peacekeepers, who had failed utterly in 1967 and proved worthless in Lebanon and Syria, a multinational force, or MNF, led by the United States, would keep the peace in the Sinai. Despite these impressive gains, Sadat was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood during a parade to honor the victory, where he was then replaced by Hosni Mubarak. The nascent age of anti-air and anti-tank missile had arrived in full force. No longer were these fringe experimental weapons. Rather, they comprised a baseline capability that all armies needed to deal with and to deal in. Likewise, the Scud missile, first used in this war, saw a need to defend against not just ICBMs, but against theater ballistic missiles. Finally, the use of manned aircraft against these new, more capable missiles carried with it an unacceptable risk, but the need for targeting and information gathered had only increased. Accordingly, Israel embarked upon the creation of an unmanned aerial system that could gather intelligence and beam it back in real time to a pilot and operator safely on the ground. The age of drone warfare was conceived in the chaos of those first few hours in October 1973, the capability being demonstrated during the 1982 war in Lebanon, and a capability we will discuss in detail next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.